It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross, Labour MP Bell Ribeiro-Addy, Politico UK political editor Jack Blanchard, and the writer, broadcaster and businessman Trevor Phillips. Today...
Are we still being guided by the science?
The gap between scientific advice and political decisions is laid bare.
Quite self-evidently, they have rejected significant recommendations here from the scientists.
We listened to that advice, as we always do, and I say we did take action, but these are balanced judgments.
Could Wales close the border to visitors from COVID hotspots in England?
North Wales Police cannot stop someone and turn them back simply because they're not following guidance. We need rules.
And we'll ask my guest Douglas Ross what he meant when he said this.
Rules.
And we'll ask my guest Douglas Ross what he meant when he said this.
I take no pleasure from saying this, but the case for separation is now being made more effectively in London than it ever could be in Edinburgh.
Well, let's start with the story that is splashed across the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And this is about the minutes from the SAGE scientists meeting on the 21st of September. They were released overnight and it is clear that they were advising much tougher national measures. SAGE urged, says the paper, PM to order a harsher lockdown. My question to the guest today is, are we still listening to the science on COVID-19?
Well, obviously, throughout this pandemic, the science have given their advice, and it's not been a unanimous voice throughout this pandemic. There have been differing views, and we've seen that right across the country. And UK Government, Scottish Government, Welsh Government, Northern Irish Government have to take on the advice from the scientific officers and the responses that they give, but ultimately make decisions that they feel are in the best interest, not only to deal with the pandemic itself and save lives, but also to balance that with saving livelihoods as well. What's
your view? Are we still listening to the science?
I'm not sure if we were ever really listening to the science. You can't pick and choose with science and those facts that they lay out. And it seems that the government have. SAGE obviously recommended that we did go into lockdown 3 weeks ago, but they also recommended a zero COVID strategy, which we didn't follow. And countries that have, like New Zealand, Australia, Vietnam, we can see that they're making progress. They've eliminated the virus, obviously not eradicated it because we don't have a vaccine, but they're going back to normal now. They're having large gatherings where people don't have to wear masks. They have very, very low numbers of people that have died. I mean, my last check on New Zealand was something like 22. In this country, we've had tens of thousands. And I think that's because we haven't been listening to science. We locked down too late, so we're having to lock down again and again.
Trevor, what's your view?
Well, I think that there have undoubtedly been a lot of errors made, but I think we need to be clear about the role of science here. People often talk about being guided by science, and I think that's reasonable. But I think we need to be careful, particularly in the areas of Westminster and politics, not to use scientists as the sort of whipping boys here, boys and girls in this case here. The truth is, scientists advise, but they do not decide, and nor should they, and they shouldn't be, the responsibility shouldn't be on them, because science isn't fact and not fact. Scientists like myself, I'm back in the world of data science now, we deal in numbers of probabilities and risks. It is for politicians to make judgments and balance what we say to them with what the other issues that they may have to take a decision on. For example, what will it mean for the economy? So I think it is quite right to say that governments must pay heed to the science, but scientists are not elected to decide on what course of actions the government should take.
Right, well, this has been an ongoing debate in terms of how closely or at all, as Bell said, the government is actually following the science, or as Trevor said, are they just guided by it? Let's just give you a flavour of what Sage scientists were recommending in these released minutes, Jack, and I'm going to ask you to comment on it in just a moment. Some of the things they were suggesting was a national circuit breaker, as it's become known, or full national lockdown for a number of weeks, and a ban on any household mixing indoors. There were others too. Jack, what did government ministers actually do after being presented with this advice by Sage?
Well, probably first of all, ran around panicking a lot, wondering what on earth they were going to do, because it's exactly the opposite of what Boris Johnson wants to be doing. He's under so much pressure from in his own party to have a more relaxed approach to the virus to allow the economy to start growing again. So this will have been an absolute bolt from the blue for him when it arrived 3 weeks ago. And sure enough, if you look at the various steps that Sage scientists have recommended, very little of them were actually implemented by the Prime Minister. You know, he did change his advice on working from home. We saw that very abrupt U-turn from him telling people they should work from home, having previously been told that they should go back to the offices. But beyond that, there was very little more. You know, this circuit breaker idea was kicked around, but ultimately it didn't go ahead. We didn't see the mass closing of gyms. We didn't see university students told to attend lectures online. And if you've seen what happened subsequently in halls of residence, that certainly looks like a decision that some people think might have been the wrong one. But as Trevor says, it is very difficult. I think Bell's wrong. You have to pick and choose to some extent, because the scientists are broadly recommending measures about the virus, but the government also has a lot of other considerations it has to weigh up. The danger for Boris Johnson is that he tries to pick a middle path and ends up, pleasing nobody at all.
But we were a good few weeks behind others in the world, in fact, and we could see what mistakes.
Are you talking about March? Back in March,
yeah, back in March, we were a good few weeks behind, and we could see what had worked. We could see what scientists were saying, not just in our country but internationally. We could have heeded the advice then and gone down the route of those countries that have been the most successful. Instead, this picking and choosing and this middle ground, and I do agree with you on that middle ground, has completely failed the country and led to the disasters we've seen, a number of deaths, and not to add the failures in procurement of PPE and ventilators and all of these things and tests, all of these things that have gone wrong simply because we firstly didn't listen to the science as we said we did, and we went down some strange route of trying to protect the economy at the same time as saving lives, which other countries have shown that we could have done if we looked at saving lives first, because that.
Let Douglas Ross respond.
Was Sir Keir Starmer wrong then to support the government's actions to get on top of this virus? Because back in March he was supporting what the government were doing. He's changed his position. He's gone back to not supporting, and now we're not sure where the Labour Party are. But back at the start of this pandemic, when you're saying there was advice from all around the world that we should have gone into lockdown earlier, the Labour Party, your party, and your leader were saying that was the right choice to take.
Do you know what? We were, as a Labour Party, and I believe what Keir Starmer was doing was what everybody wanted to do, which was support the government in making sure that, we put down the best measures possible for the country. But when lockdown came into place, we supported it fully. There was many arguments about us going into lockdown too late. I made an argument in the House of Commons about us going into lockdown too late and found myself with COVID the very next day. Those arguments were, but as soon as the government decided to go into lockdown, we supported the government because that was the right thing for the country.
Do you want to withdraw support from the government now, Bell?
No, I want to support, if the government put forward measures that I think are reasonable and will help, kind of quell the rise.
So do you support the three-tiered system?
No, I don't support the three-tier system. I think it's ridiculous.
So how can you say you don't support the three-tier system, which we're trying to have a UK-wide approach to this, because this is a virus that doesn't respect borders, and the same in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We've got to look at how we respond to this together, collectively. But you say you want to get on top of the virus, you want to stop the spike in infections, you want to stop the number of people that are daily still losing their lives, yet you don't support a measure that tries to get on top of this to protect the people who are in the areas that have the highest rate of infection at the moment.
Your argument is that the only way to deal with this is a three-tiered system.
So what's your alternative to that?
I don't think it is. Sage were very clear about what should have been done before.
But now, what is your alternative to the three-tier system?
Strategy. I don't think necessarily our regional lockdowns are working. There's been so many differences in the types of advice that have been put down. This 10 p.m. rule, for example, has come across as very, very bizarre. We need to be very, very clear about what we're saying in these different areas.
Well, on that, in terms of the science, the scientists don't support from these minutes the idea of specificity when it comes to geographical locations, and they also didn't think that the 10 p.m. curfew was really a proposal that they would support. It was marginal. So, again, what are you basing the decisions on?
As Trevor has said, we have to take all the advice from the scientists, which will differ between different scientists. Some will support measures, some won't. But ultimately, the government and all the governments across the United Kingdom have to look at the advice and then make a decision based on that advice, sometimes to follow the scientific guidance and sometimes to have an alternative to try and meet the same aims, which is to get on top of this virus, to stop the infection rates increasing right across the country and to stop people losing their lives as a result of it.
But, Trevor, people will question what the government is basing their decisions on. If not on the science, as you say, scientists advise and then politicians make those decisions, what are they basing it on?
Well, when you say whether they're basing it on this or that, there are several different factors, and what is recommended by SAGE will be one of those factors. And where I agree with Bell is that government could have been clearer, more transparent and more honest about the things that are guiding its judgment. I don't think anybody in this country would be in the least bit disturbed or anxious if the Prime Minister said, look, I know that I've got a health issue, and if I only had to deal with a health issue, this is what I do. I know I've got an economic issue, and if I only had to deal with this, that's what I would do. But actually, the truth of the matter is, just as every household is having to make decisions about how it behaves, I have to make a decision that judges these things in the round. And where I come down in this balance is X or Y. I think the government hasn't done that very well. But having said all of that, speaking again from, is it worth the scientific community? I think we need to be really careful about saying the scientists said this and therefore we've got to do that, because actually scientists do not work that way. What SAGE has actually said is, if it were left to us and we only had this bit of the problem to solve, this is what we would do. They do not address the other issues about the cost, including cost in lives, of an economic turndown. And I just want to make one really big point. A couple of decades ago, back in Italy, where there was a big earthquake and the scientists hadn't predicted it, what actually happened then was, because everybody said it's a scientist's fault, they're in charge, 6 scientists were tried for murder. Now, actually, we do not want to get into that place. Scientists advise, politicians decide, and I wish actually all of the politicians would be more honest and say, look, we are making a balance of judgments here. We recognise that we might not be right, but we have the responsibility to make that decision, and this is the way we're going.
All right.
Rather than saying there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer, end of story.
Right, well, let's have a look at New Zealand. This tweet, because you mentioned it, Belle, said that we should be following their lead. Your colleague Richard Bergen has tweeted, when I say zero COVID, which you support, is the way we can get back to a semblance of normality. The scenes from the rugby in New Zealand this weekend show this. Last week, New Zealand announced it had eliminated coronavirus after following a zero COVID strategy. Is this the sort of thing that you think would happen if we followed New Zealand by closing the borders, which is what they've done since March the 19th?
Well, you'd have to do that at some point in time, yes. But they haven't closed the borders completely. In fact, I remember...
They have effectively closed the borders since March the 19th, and effectively they're still shut.
A few months ago, they had 2 new cases. I remember the story of coronavirus, and they were for British people travelling into New Zealand. So they must have at some point had the borders
But only for relatives.
open.
Only for relatives. They were effectively shut, Belle. So is that the sort of thing that you would like to see to fulfil that zero COVID approach?
Well, I think we'd have to be reasonable about it. It makes sense where they've done it. They've been able to eliminate it in that sense. And I think there are ways to go about it where people are being checked better at the airports, which we're not doing in this country. We are not checking people at the airports in the way that we should.
But are you suggesting, is it the Labour Party policy to close all our borders? No, and is that reasonable? Because you used the word reasonable, and I'm not sure closing all our borders would be deemed as reasonable.
That's certainly not what the Labour Party policy is.
But you're saying we should follow the New Zealand approach?
We should follow the New Zealand approach. I didn't say we should follow exactly what New Zealand have done at every single step of the way.
They have managed to eliminate
where it has been reasonable, they've taken taken certain steps. So we have to assess
so closing the borders wouldn't be
what's
reasonable.
reasonable for us. At this stage, I believe that if we were checking people properly at the airports, we wouldn't have to necessarily, and it wouldn't be reasonable to have to close the borders.
All right, I'm going to move on and put it slightly differently. Jack, we've talked about the claim that Boris Johnson is ignoring the science, or certainly not following their advice closely enough. But on his side, there are many Tories who believe he's been captured by them.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the sort of pincer movement Boris Johnson finds himself stuck in, is that all his a lot of his core supporters and his own party and the wider voters as well think he's already gone much too far in terms of lockdowns and so forth. And the last thing they want to see is harsher measures coming in now, just as they hoped the economy was starting to move back towards a better place. And so, that will have weighed heavily on his mind when he's weighing up these judgments, without a doubt, because he's a prime minister who is coming for a huge amount of stick this year. And the last thing he needs is to further ebb away that very core support that he's got. And this is why it's so difficult for him. He's trying to balance so many different things at once. I think the real problem that he's got, and if you look at those Sage minutes again, just to go back to them, there's one other thing we haven't mentioned, which is how brutal about Boris Johnson's test and trace system, which, of course, he promised would be world-beating by the summer. We're now in the middle of October, and Sage says test and trace is having a marginal impact on rates of transmission. This was supposed to be the big thing that saved us from needing another lockdown. And the reason that Sage has come back with these recommendations for harsher measures is because it's just not working. And that's despite 10, 12 billion pounds of public money lavished on it. And that is something that we have seen be more effective in other countries. Other countries have been better at getting a system up and running quickly to try and get a hold of the virus. And we don't seem to be able to do that here. And I feel very vulnerable on that point. And
Douglas?
We'll continue.
Absolutely. I mean, the way we'll get through this is with a test and trace system that can absolutely identify people who have been infected.
But we were promised it would be in place already by now.
And as we've heard, there's international comparisons where it's been done well. There's other parts of the United Kingdom. I mean, there are still issues in Scotland with the test and trace capability. We heard on Radio Scotland just this morning that care home tests are now taking far longer since the schools went back. These are people that we need to get these tests turned around very quickly. So right across the country there are issues with this, but I'm not here to defend any failure in the system because it is something we need to get on top of.
But you admit
quickly.
It has fallen short, hasn't it?
Absolutely. You just look at the figures and see this is an area that has to be prioritised. If we don't get on top of this, we can't then follow all the people who have been contacted by someone.
No, I understand why it doesn't work, but whose fault is that?
Well, the ultimate responsibility is with the government, and the Health Secretary, the Prime Minister have said that throughout this crisis. We've got to improve it. We will look back in any investigation and inquiry in areas that need to be improved, and this is one that we need to take action on right now to get on top of the virus.
Right, well, let's turn to these...
It doesn't work in Parliament. It doesn't work in Westminster.
Right.
It doesn't work in Parliament when we have MPs from the SNP who test positive for COVID and still go into Parliament.
But it wasn't just that member of Parliament. We've received an email, if you recall, that there have been some other cases on the estate, and not once has our test and trace pinged. So it's not working at all.
All right, we're going to move on. We're going to turn to the issue in Wales because there the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, has written to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, saying he has the last chance to take action. And this is where ministers have warned the government to restrict travel from English COVID hotspots. We can talk to the Welsh Health Minister, Vaughan Gething. Vaughan, welcome to the programme. What do you want Boris Johnson to do?
We want him to introduce travel restrictions in some very high areas. We know that there's now a three-tier system within England, and so England are already recognised. They have areas of very high prevalence. We have good evidence, unfortunately, that travel from those high prevalence areas into Wales is a reason for the virus being imported into different communities. Right. We've taken our own action, of course, in Wales, where we have got travel restrictions in place in terms of some of our local higher areas of prevalence. That measure would not just protect people in different parts of Wales, it would protect people in low prevalence areas of England.
Okay.
So
well, I understand what you...
Line readers compared to Liverpool are very, very different. It's just about people who live in high prevalence areas in any part of the UK, not just England.
Right. Well, there are restrictions, of course, on travel, non-essential travel in and out of the region of Liverpool because they're in that Tier 3 as part of the system. So where else are you talking about?
Well, with respect, they're not restrictions. It's a matter of guidance. And the problem is that if someone is travelling through a very high area and the guidance says you shouldn't really leave that area, you can't enforce that if people are nevertheless looking to book their holiday on the Helene Peninsula or in Anglesey. So the challenge is something that is generally enforceable. And we have been here before, because when we had stay local travel rules in Wales, the police were able to enforce that, and they did so successfully. Broadly, though, it meant that when people were travelling, if they weren't aware of the rules, the police engaged with them, explain what the rules are, and they turn back. We're looking to have rules that protect all of us in all parts of the UK, and it really is about understanding the highest prevalence areas, minimising the risk to lower prevalence areas, and how not to keep Wales safe, but every part of the UK.
If Boris Johnson doesn't act in the way you have just outlined, will you close the border? Mark Drayford said closing the borders isn't his preferred option, but it would be possible. Is that right?
This isn't about closing the border. It's about using the powers we have under the Public Health Act to introduce health protections against travel from certain parts where there is a high prevalence area. So we've already had conversations with our lawyers here about the powers. We're clear the powers exist. We're also clear we need to have a rational basis for that. So we need to set a level of the extent of population extent, so the cases per 100,000 likely, and the possibility of other measures. So it's important to understand why certain areas travel is restricted as opposed to others. Otherwise, we would just be acting on a national basis. We're looking on a basis that is there a higher risk of coronavirus being imported into Wales? Can we protect people from harm?
I understand all of that. What's not clear, well, certainly not to me, is are you saying that you will turn people away at the border, let's say rules were brought in effect, closing the border to English tourists, for example, from high COVID hotspots? You will turn them away. You will shut Wales from England.
No, well, I see that's the problem. It's not shutting Wales from England. It's any part of the UK with high prevalence areas. And it does mean that people
how would it work in practice?
Because in practice, we have been able to understand whether people are travelling longer distances. We had this in Stay Local, when we had our Stay Local rules. The police were able to enforce that, and people then understood and respected the fact there were rules in place. So the idea this isn't enforceable is just rubbish, because we've been around this track some way before. This is about people understanding clearly that we want everyone to be able to work safely together, to understand how through the pandemic together, but high prevalence areas, there is a very powerful rationale for making sure that travel is restricted to protect all other parts of the UK.
Right. Well, I've got Douglas Ross, Conservative MP, here in the studio. Douglas, listening to that, how do you respond?
Well, I'm still unclear what the Labour government's position is in Wales. The First Minister is saying they could close the borders, yet the Health Secretary is suggesting that's not going to be an option. And
well, he wants legal restrictions to travel, not just from Liverpool, but perhaps also Nottinghamshire, the North East, anybody travelling to Wales, probably heading there for half-term.
But the reference that this was able to be done before was at a time when, I mean, if you walked around London, you barely saw a car. This was when there was a national lockdown and no one was travelling, so it was very easy to identify the very small numbers who were. We're now suggesting that if you close the border, what about people who live in Wales but work in England, or live in England and work in Wales? What happens to them? And it just seems a very unclear message, and I didn't get to the bottom of what the position with the Labour Party and the Labour government in Wales is.
Vaughan?
Well, that's a deliberate misunderstanding of the position. And we can either have a sensible conversation, we can pretend that things are being said when they're not. The ability to travel for work between areas where people do work, we have never restricted that. Essential travel for work has always been permitted, apart from at the start of the March lockdown. We were talking about the Stay Local rules we had in place through a good part of the summer when other travel was permitted. This isn't that difficult. Our police were able to enforce the rules and people respected those rules. This is about whether we're prepared to act to keep people safe with very clear evidence that we are seeing importation of coronavirus from high prevalence areas within the UK. And of course, we've done this already with international quarantine measures, where every government within the UK agrees on a series of measures because we recognise that in the higher prevalence areas in other parts of the world, there is a risk of COVID being re-imported into our communities where there isn't the same extent. And of course, we've seen direct evidence of that importation from Greek islands and a range of other holiday destinations. There's a very clear logic about how all four governments have behaved up to this point in time.
Douglas?
I still think the message is unclear. Are you in agreement with the First Minister of Wales that you can and will close the border, or are you saying you don't want to do that because there are other measures that can be introduced before that?
No, what I'm saying is that I think that every time when people talk about closing the border, it's a
like
deliberate
the First Minister.
debate. And it's really about saying at the border, we could stop people from high prevalence areas. This isn't about saying this is about England. It's about high prevalence areas in any part of the UK. And that's the point. Because if you look at what we've done in Wales, we've intervened at an earlier point than England has to try to have restrictions in place to help keep Wales safe.
All right, Vaughan.
And that's really important about the message we have about the need to do this and the risk in not doing so, as we see in all other parts of the UK and in Wales, where measures are now required to intervene even further into people's lives.
How long has the Prime Minister got to respond?
We really need an answer this week, because otherwise we'll have to introduce our own measures. And, of course, the Prime Minister has given interviews but not responded to the previous letter from the First Minister. And I do think it wouldn't be that difficult for him to put pen to paper and provide a proper response and rationale. Why not? In yesterday's meeting, some UK ministers claimed they weren't aware of evidence about the spread and importation of COVID from high prevalence areas to lower ones. So we're going to provide some direct evidence together with the First Minister's letter, and we look forward to a rapid response.
All right, it's got till the end of the week. Jack, what do you make of that?
I think the people who'll be rubbing their hands loving it will be Douglas's opponents, is the SNP up in Scotland, who will just be looking at the way that this whole pandemic and the different approaches to it are creating these divisions across the country, and they will be loving every minute of it, and looking ahead to the Scottish elections next year. And I'm sure Plaid Cymru will be the same in Wales. And it's a difficult situation again for Boris Johnson. There isn't really a right answer. You know, he's made the decision that people in these high areas can still move to other parts of the country, and of course under his rules that means Wales and Scotland too.
All right, Vaughan, thank you very much for joining us. Just before we move on, you may remember this story. I think we can show you the headline in the Guardian newspaper. Trevor, you were asked to be part of the inquiry to investigate the high levels of BAME deaths from COVID and whether there are variations by ethnicity. Now, the inquiry went ahead, but it went ahead without you. I'm sorry, we don't seem to have that headline. What happened?
Well, I think what happened was that, of course, this all got caught up in politics, and everybody always says they're guided by the science unless and until they run into a political difficulty, in this case, an ethnic politics difficulty. And the outcome, by the way, of all of that was that not just us, but no scientific expertise, no university team, no research team was involved in what Public Health England put out. And that, frankly, that tells you the story of how valuable that particular exercise was. I just wanted to make a quick point about the discussion we've just been having. I think it demonstrates one central issue. This is such a centralised country that actually a big part of our problem has been everything has to be decided in Whitehall. We were slow because everything had to be decided on in Whitehall. We have problems now, and we talk about divisions. The truth of the matter is every part of this country is different. And I think if we're moving towards giving more authority to local authorities and to regional governments, the Welsh Assembly government, Scottish government, that is a good thing, because this virus does not operate in the same way in every part of this country, and we need to be able to respond directly. The work that we're doing, for example, now with the test and trace team, who, by the way, just, a little bit of balance here, are actually doing quite a good job against very difficult technical odds, which we haven't got time to go into. I think, actually, the more we localise the response, the more effective we will be. And that's what they found in France, which is an incredibly centralised country, but they've gone local.
Bell?
Specifically on test and trace. Test and trace has been an absolute joke. And you're talking about localised responses. I think that's the reason why we have public health devolved, and why we're different countries within the United Kingdom are allowed to act in certain ways to protect their particular populations. I think that's the right thing, as you have said. But test and trace has been a disgrace. I can't speak to certain technical difficulties when that many billions of pounds has been spent on something. Surely those billions of pounds are so that we don't have technical difficulties.
Trevor?
Well, one of the things we say in engineering is concrete only dries at the rate it dries. And when we say we don't have these technical difficulties, the truth is they just exist because people behave in a particular way. I'm not particularly arguing with you and defending what's happened on test and trace. All I'm saying is that the way that we construct things in this country make it very difficult for those of us who are actually in the business of delivering to do what we have to do.
All right.
Whether it's a question of information or actually moving logistics or whatever it is. That's what we're having to deal with every single day.
All right, we're going to move on. Douglas, I'm going to talk to you in a moment about leadership of the Scottish Conservative Party. But last night you were one of 14 Conservative MPs who rebelled against the government on the agriculture bill. Why?
Because I felt there was a lot of reassurances from the government ministers, and the minister is excellent, Victoria Prentice, and it's a manifesto commitment from every Conservative MP to uphold the animal welfare and food safety standards in this country. But I thought there was an opportunity to reinforce that further by voting for the amendment that came from the House of Lords.
But it's very curious that you don't actually trust your government's own word. It says it's committed to high standards, will maintain or exceed current standards on food production. Is their word not enough?
It is, and that's what I said in the speech last night. We all have the ultimate same destination that we want to get to, which is protecting our world-leading standards that our farmers have built up and our food producers have built up for generations, but we can take a different route to get there. And I decided last night to reinforce the message that the government is already putting out to protect our world-beating standards.
Right, but no other Tory MPs in Scotland joined you?
No, but 13
Why not?
13 others from across the benches did, and it was a decision I took. I made my point in between speeches from other Scottish Conservatives who took a different view, and I was trying to say it was perfectly possible that we both reach the same destination, just take a different route.
Right. I mean, you recently addressed members of your party at Conservative Party conference. It was virtual, of course. Let's have a listen to what you had to say.
Talk of defeatism and disinterest towards the future of our union is rife. Is this really how members of our party see the future of our country? By devolving and forgetting, those who believe that independence is inevitable strengthen the SNP's own arguments. I take no pleasure from saying this, but the case for separation is now being made more effectively in London than it ever could be in Edinburgh.
Douglas, who's making the case in London and how are they making it?
Well, I was saying this in a speech to Conservative and Unionist members right across the country, that unionism and the union is in our DNA, it's in our party name, it's about everything we do. And I want to get the message across that this government and previous governments of both Labour and Conservative since 1999 and the re-establishment of the Scottish Parliament have in many cases devolved and forgotten, and therefore we have increased some of the messaging from the SNP to support separation, when actually we should be doing everything possible to reinforce that we have two governments in Scotland.
Right.
They can work together and they can deliver together for Scotland.
But it was quite a claim. The case for separation is now being made more effectively in London by your own government.
From the SNP to support separation, when actually we should be doing everything possible to reinforce that we have two governments in Scotland.
Right.
They can work together and they can deliver together for Scotland.
But it was quite a claim. The case for separation is now being made more effective.
Telling the UK government officials they won't engage in it. So we need to put forward that levelling up agenda. But yes, I think the Prime Minister would accept that his government and successive UK governments have not done enough to strengthen the case for the union. And that's why I said it gave me no pleasure to say it, but we need to realise it. We need to look in the mirror and think what individual MPs, party members and government ministers can do to strengthen the case for the union.
All right, and you do include your government in that. But are you concerned? I mean, there is a sort of suggestion in what you were saying about the parties focusing too much, your party, on England, that the Conservative Party and members in England risk becoming a party of English nationalism.
Well, what I'm saying is you can't just assume that if separation were to happen, it wouldn't affect the rest of the United Kingdom. Our flag, the Union Jack flying there above Portcullis House, wouldn't be the Union Jack anymore if you take out Scotland. I mean,
the polling shows your party's members care more about Brexit than they do about the Union. I mean, how do you convince them of Scotland's value to the Union? I mean, it was a poll in 2019, but there was a clear majority of rank-and-file Conservative members who would accept Scottish independence or Northern Ireland leaving the UK at the price of Brexit.
And I think they're totally wrong. The union of the United Kingdom that has served all four nations so well for over 300 years, the most powerful political and economic union this world has ever seen, is one that we as Conservative and Unionists should be focused on day in, day out and deliver on.
Jack, is Boris Johnson's government the problem, not just successive governments, as Douglas has been saying?
It's certainly a very big part of the problem. And before that, Boris Johnson leading the Brexit campaign was also a pretty big problem for Scottish Unionists. And you hear a lot of talk in public from Scottish Tory MPs or from Tory MPs about the importance of the union to them, but the actions don't always seem to follow. And, you know, quietly, you do speak to some Tory MPs down here who will say, you know, in a quieter, unguarded moment, you know, if Scotland really wants to go, then, you know, let them go and we'll have England to ourselves. Thank you very much. It's not always as unified a view in private as it comes across in public. And
that totally ignores what we are as a union of the United Kingdom. And that's why it was a stark message. And some people said, you know, it maybe didn't mean anything to them, it wasn't relevant to them, and they are the ones I was speaking to. They had to look themselves in the mirror and say, this speech is about you, because if we want to protect and preserve our union, a union that delivers for Scotland and Scotland delivers for other parts of the United Kingdom, we all have to up our fight to do that.
Right, Trevor, do you think there is also a sense that there are many people who are in favour and want to keep the union, but it isn't more than a sort of nostalgic, emotional attachment?
Well, there may be people who think that. I don't agree with that at all. I think that the union in this country has provided a really fundamental value to this nation, which we can see by contrast in other countries. One of the things that is absolutely wreaking havoc across the globe right now, we're seeing it in the United States, is that what they call identity politics, that is to say, divisions which are based on issues not to do with income or wealth, but actually to do with confessional divide, religion, background, and so on, are absolutely tearing nations apart. For the last 500-600 years before the Union, this country was one of the places where actually you could see a nation doing the job of bringing and holding people together. And I think that the value of the Union, I think, was much under stressed in the arguments about the referendum in 2014. I don't think that people are going to be persuaded by, you know, the so-called economic case. I think that a case has to be made by all of the major parties for the union as a way of holding together societies that could be fragmented. The problem we've got at the moment, actually, is that I think there are people in both major parties who think, actually, that we don't really need it. There are some Tories who think, you know, let them go and we'll have England forever. And I think there are some people in the Labour Party who think, OK, what we need to do is maybe let it go, but make a deal with the SNP. I don't think either of those futures is the right thing for the United Kingdom.
Bell, is that what's happening in the Labour Party?
I've not heard that at all, Trevor, so I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. I take a slightly different view that the way in which the government is behaving in terms of, you know, hurtling towards a no-deal Brexit is making the union very unattractive to Scottish nationalists and to Scotland overall. Those are the things that I believe are most threat to the union.
And yet Labour continues to struggle desperately in Scotland, I mean, even more so than the Tories.
Well, I think that's something that's happened over the course of a couple of years, and I think that's something that's set to change in the course of the next few years, actually.
All right, Trevor,
to be clear, Joe, just so Bell doesn't misunderstand me, the attitudes I described are minorities in both the Conservatives and Labour Party.
Okay.
I don't think that's a position of the party leaderships, but I think both party leaderships need to make sure that those positions don't gain ground.
All right, I wanted to ask you about something else, Trevor, which is your name was mentioned, tipped as a contender for BBC chairman. Are you interested? Do you want the job?
What does the chairman of the BBC actually do, Joe? Let me know and I'll talk about it.
I'm sure there's a job spec somewhere for you, Trevor, to look at. Would you like it? Would you like it?
I'll check it out.
OK, you'll go as far as looking at it. Have you been approached?
I'll look at the job description.
All right, that's as clear as anything, I suppose. Let's talk about something that's going on in the media, because they are grappling with this issue, which we can show you in the Times newspaper. Minorities overrepresented on TV. This is on screen, but continue to be sidelined off screen. Is there an illusion of diversity being created in broadcasting, Trevor?
Well, I think there can be. I wouldn't get too overexcited about on-screen diversity being represented. I think, minorities are there, but actually not always in the places we'd want to be in terms of authority, in terms of prime time and so on. Though, there are brilliant people like Michaela Cohen and so who've made tremendous breakthroughs. I think the more important question is, who are the decision makers? And actually, despite the fact that there have been some people who've now moved in, June Sarpong at the BBC is a member of their board, a woman called Adi Rawcliffe at ITV have become quite significant figures. The truth of the matter is that it is the same as it was, frankly, when I was a TV executive, and that's 25 years ago, when there were only, I think, 3 or 4 of us in senior positions. And we used to say, let's never get in a taxi together, because if we do, that's the end of people of colour in British broadcasting. I mean, I think that this is a very, very important point, because if television is there to give a narrative to what it means to be British, going back to the discussion we were having about the union, then I think the people of colour have to be woven into that narrative. And that can only be done if we are there in positions of authority within the broadcasting organisations.
How do you see it in this article?
Well, I think that's probably quite a few things that I would agree with Trevor on there, which is quite a surprise. We shouldn't be excited about the fact that we are...
You are allowed to agree occasionally, go on.
We shouldn't be overexcited about the fact that there are, people from ethnic minorities represented on television in different shows, and we certainly shouldn't be thinking, gosh, that's changed, because Trevor's right in that some of the ways in which they're portrayed is absolutely awful, and it can't be a surprise. Just every single time one of these reports is, released about, gosh, there aren't, a certain number of black, Asian and minority ethnic people in certain positions of power, everyone's like, oh, gosh, that's shocking. That's been the case for years. Report after report has been released, stressing these points. And loads of these reports even have recommendations on how to change it. I would like to see how we're going to set about changing it, not just talk about what the situation is.
Jack, is this a problem across the media, not just in broadcasting?
Yeah, it's an enormous problem across the media. I can't speak to broadcasting, but I've spent many years working in newspapers and now in the online world, and I'm afraid it's really no better at all. You look at the senior executives at newspapers, and there are very, very few people of colour working in those sorts of jobs. I look in my own profession, in the lobby, the core of political journalists that work in Westminster. There's very, very few people of colour there. I mean, there's even very few women, frankly. I mean, it's a huge problem. And one that, as Bell says, we've talked about for years, and it's going to take people at the very top taking some very serious decisions about who gets promoted and who gets offered opportunities. Yeah. If it's ever going to change.
Right, well, I mean, the new Director General, Tim Davey, has said he intends to create a 50-20-12 organisation. That's a reference to the proportion of staff who are female from BAME backgrounds and those that have disabilities, and that people won't be promoted unless they are actively working towards that. Would you support that, Belle? Yeah,
I think that's absolutely a reasonable proposal moving forward. But again, it's another one of those things that has similar things have been proposed in the past and they've not actually happened. How do we make sure this actually happens?
Trevor, do you think it will happen this time?
I think it's a good signal. I don't know Tim Davey well at all. I've met him a couple of times. He seems like a serious guy who's going to do what he wants, what he says he's going to do. So I think give him a fair win, let him do what he wants to do. One small fact. I, as you probably know, became a Times columnist earlier on this year. And for a reason which I don't need to go into, I was discussing with my editor the position of black columnists. And actually, we went to look, and across the whole of Fleet Street, there are only 2 black columnists regularly in any big paper, myself and Nesrin Malik at The Guardian. Amongst opinion mongers in this country, we should really be thinking, why is that? I know that I'm actually talking down my value as a scarce resource, but actually it is just mad.
Right.
It's unacceptable.
Is that mad, Douglas?
Well, I was just going to go back to Jack's point about the lobby and such. Like, I did a virtual speech to business leaders across Scotland yesterday and took questions from the business community and then 5 or 6 questions from the Scottish media, and all those questions came from white male journalists. So that's an issue that we've got to address.
Right, and how would you address it?
Well, there's a number of options, but as Bell has said, for too long we've looked at the issue but not come up with the solutions or followed the solutions forward. So I think it's something, there is some progress now being made, but we need to make more progress and do that quicker.
Right, that's all we've got time for, but thank you very much to all of our guests today and to you two, of course, for being here in the studio with me. We'll be back tomorrow for PMQs.